And we're live. Hi, everybody. I'm Ryan Schumacher. Welcome to episode number 2, or week 2 for the Bible Geeks series. This is the series being done in parallel with the sermon series at the First Presbyterian Church of River Forest in the fall of 2017 on covenants. And so we've had a video on guidelines for biblical interpretation. We had one last week on an introduction to the class, and then all the history from Adam all the way through the Tower of Babel. So now we're actually going to get into the covenants. We're going to get into the meat of what this whole sermon series is about. We got some new video software too, so my background's a little bit better. I may blur in and out, we'll see. If you catch me looking down, it's because I'm trying to make sure I'm still in focus, and we'll see if this also helps going through it. So the idea for this episode, we're going to go through a couple topics. We're going to talk about what is a covenant. We use that word, we keep using that word, but it doesn't mean what we think it means. There's going to be some theological questions. Why does God enter into covenants with humans? And then we're going to go specifically into the covenant with Abraham, and you find that Genesis 12 through 22. There's a few stories that are intermixed in between, but Genesis 12, 15, 17, 22, those are the big points in time for the covenant with Abraham. And we're going to really go into Genesis 12 and Genesis 15. 17 and 22, we won't necessarily get all the way to those, but I think we'll be able to make our points using just those 12 and 15. Okay, so the first step here. What is a covenant? So what is a covenant as far as we're concerned? We're familiar with the concept of a contract. So a contract is something where, like, I agree to perform a specific task, and you agree to pay me for that task, for instance. So contracts are something that's, enshrined in law. We understand that there's lots of protections around those. We don't use the word covenant very often, but we should try and know what it means, because covenant is language that's used in the Bible, and covenant is language that's used in the Bible to talk about the way that God relates to humans and the way humans relate back to God. So we're not in a contract with God right now. We're in a covenant, and these are distinct. And it's a weird category. We don't really talk about that hardly ever in a regular life, even though we should. For most people, a covenant will be part of their life at some point, and that's the covenant of marriage. So that's the analogy between God and the church, or Christ and the church, is given to be the analogy of a husband and wife coming together in marriage. And so we have a parallel there, but we want to give a definition behind it. What is a covenant? And so one of my Old Testament professors, so Dr. Dan Lane at Wheaton College, he's an adjunct at Wheaton College, did his dissertation on this topic and gave us a very precise definition of what a covenant is. And here it is. So the covenant is a lifelong, unchangeable, solemn agreement between two designated parties, which one or both make an oath-bound pledge to the other to perform a specified commitment, or else suffer the wrath of God. All right, so that's really, there's lots of clauses in there. There's lots of descriptors of what the covenant is. And the attempt here is to be very thorough and very specific. For instance, you see lots of these modifiers here highlighted, and we're going to go into how these really affect covenant. So you've got the lifelong, you got the unchangeable, the solemn binding agreement, two designated parties, oath-bound pledge, perform a specified commitment, or else suffer the wrath of God. So these are the components of a covenant. And we'll get into it, but you can probably already tell the difference between this and a contract just by looking at this. So when we go through these points, keep in mind that even though, like we've talked about, covenant is not something that is big in our daily lives, or at least in the way we think about it. It's actually big in most of our lives, but it's not a concept that we think of often. This is a genre commonly used in the ancient Near East. So covenant was one of the ways It's hard for me to say if it's the primary way or not. I'm not enough of an ancient Near Eastern historian to say, but it is one of the known ways that ancient Near Eastern governments, kings, interacted with each other. Um, and so we want to look at that. We want to understand the historical context, um, and then we want to figure out how that historical context will help us understand our relationship to God. Because if we understand the way that people at the time thought about covenant, then we can look at the way the Bible is talking about covenant in describing the relationship between us and God. To say that one more time, kind of like we were talking about, this is an ancient text. The Bible here is written at the time, by people in that time, to people at that time. One of the things that we talked about a bit last week, something I believe that the text can't mean what it never meant. This is historically situated. It's for us, though. We need to understand the backdrop, what this would have meant to the people at the time in specifics, so we can then understand in specifics how we are relating to God right now. So if we put it in its historical context, we can then start to see what our relationship with God is supposed to be like in terms that we can understand using our idiom. We can translate it. If we can understand the history, then we can bring it to our contemporary time. And then we're going to see there are some differences between how covenants play out between gods and humans. Gods actually, not really. No. God, Yahweh, and humans, because it was actually a unique relationship. But also because God is immortal, unchangeable, omnipotent. It's going to change a few things in the way that the covenants apply. And so we need to be able to compare, but we also need to be able to contrast with the historical context. Okay, so we're going to now start getting into the components of this definition. I'm going to start with the solemn binding agreement because those first few modifiers, lifelong, unchangeable, they're modifying this agreement along with the solemn binding agreement. So for it to be solemn and binding, and some of these things might seem self-evident, but I think it's important to go through anyway. So something solemn, this is not flippant, this is not casual. This is serious stuff. In fact, when you look at the consequences, when we start to get into the things that really define what a covenant is, it's serious in some ways, and in some covenants, it's deadly serious. The penalty for violating the covenant can be death in some cases. You won't see that in most of the biblical covenants, but the solemnity behind it is showing that when you enter into a covenant, it's a big deal. And then binding, it's something that the parties can be held to. So when we think of a binding agreement or something that's binding in contemporary life, we're thinking more like legislation that's passed, not like a UN resolution. So United Nations gets together and they say, the Security Council condemns this government or that government for doing something. By the way, everybody, this is Fritz. This is my cat. He just jumped on me, and he's going to have to get down now. I figured I'd do that since some of you may have seen the tail. So this is more like a law. This is, legislation is passed, and then the courts and the executive branch, law enforcement, act on that. And that's kind of what makes it binding. For something to be truly binding, there has to be an or else. It's a difference between like a resolution and a law. In the United Nations, they condemn something. There's no teeth behind it. There's nothing that actually happens. There's no or else. Whereas if legislation is passed in Congress, then you have the executive branch, you have law enforcement, you have the judiciary that will, nothing ever prevents you from breaking the law. But if you do, then there are consequences. So that's one of the things that goes along with being a binding agreement is that there is an or else attached to it. So yeah, it's not just a statement of purpose or intent. Because it's solemn, because it's binding, this is a promise. So the agreement contains a promise. So the agreement then, another thing to note about covenants, it represents a new part in the relationship. So this isn't confirming something that's already there. You're coming into a new agreement. So that's one of the other ways in which like the marriage analogy plays well. You're not when you enter into marriage, you're not confirming a relationship that's already there. Uh, you're coming to a new understanding of the relationship. You're declaring it publicly. And covenants are entered into by choice. This is an important thing to understand too. There's no covenant if it's unilaterally imposed. Something that would be unilaterally imposed would not be a covenant. That would be, uh, I mean, just exerting force of will. There's a difference between that and a covenant because a covenant is entered into by both parties. And in the ancient Near East, you see negotiation with it often. So before you enter into a solemn binding agreement, sort of like a contract, you're going to discuss the terms of that agreement. Um, Now, in the ancient Near East, covenants, in particular, a kind of covenant that we'll get to, a vassal covenant, was negotiated and entered into by choice, but perhaps under duress, such as a condition of surrender. So the king's got his army surrounding your city. He sends his emissary to you and says, "Look, I've got a deal for you. Uh, I won't crush you, and you will pay me tribute. How does that sound?" Now, there is the, there is the option to say no, and then there's the consequence of saying no in that particular situation. So it's by choice. Regardless, we're not saying it's a fully free and happily agreed to thing all the time. Particularly, you see this in the ancient Near East. You're not really going to find that in the biblical covenants. Now, another thing to say about the negotiation, there's no evidence in the Bible that covenant terms were negotiated between God and humans. These were basically take it or leave it offers. They were still accepted. So it's not like there's a difference between a unilateral imposition, regardless of what you have to say, versus negotiating, versus I'm making you an offer, take it or leave it offer. People do that when they're negotiating for houses all the time. This is my last offer. You have a choice to say yes or no, but there's no further negotiation at that point. You see this in particular with the Sinai covenant. There's a very explicit take it or leave it here in the Sinai covenant in Exodus 19. Despite that, though, all of these offers, when God said, "Okay, Abraham, here's what I'm going to do for you," Abraham wasn't magically transported to Canaan against his desire. David could have refused to have a son. There is cooperation that goes along with the covenant. There's a choice that's associated with it. Lifelong. So here, when we're talking about marriage as the analogy here, this is the one that we definitely know. As long as we both shall live. But let's back up a second from that. Let's not let it be a trite aphorism here. When you think of this in terms of diplomacy, for instance, as long as we both shall live, feels really different. You can't. If Barack Obama had made an "as long as we both shall live" covenant with another nation, that would be really bizarre to us because he's not president anymore. It's really in our day and age, it's as long as our legislature stays committed to that, or our executive branch stays committed to that policy. Depends on if it's a formal treaty or if it's a policy we're taking. So this is not how we operate today. In the United States right now, we operate very much based on the policy set forth. Foreign policy is, often done mainly by the executive branch, though the Constitution puts a lot of power in the legislature regarding foreign policy. But you see that the policies of different presidential administrations affect foreign policy in particular. So it's nowhere near as long as we both shall live. Same thing like with a contract. I will build your house as long as we both shall live. I mean, that's the best warranty you'll ever get, for sure. Somebody will make sure that it's up and running all the time. I'd love that. But it's a differentiation here. A contract is good until the work is done, and a covenant is not annulled or set aside until the death of one of the parties. So this is about a relationship between two parties, not just a thing or an action. And something to consider too when we think about the difference between human covenants and covenant with God. God's not going to die. So in terms of this whole "as long as we both shall live" thing is concerned, at least on God's end, so that's never going to change. Human beings, though, obviously humans die. Every one of us will return to dust. Um, but it's important to then look at who the parties are, because in the circumstances of many of the covenants, the party of the covenant are future people as well as current people, people yet to be born, for instance. Uh, and so this will be an interesting thing to look at and how it translates to the biblical covenants. But if you just want to think ancient Near Eastern perspective, this would be like a lifelong binding of one king to another. So think of it that way. And if you have like city-states in the ancient Near East, to the extent that what they had would be called a city-state, two kings would come to an agreement for life, and that would represent the foreign policy, so to speak, of that day and age. Unchangeable, I mean, this one's pretty self-explanatory. There's not much to say on unchangeable. There are no amendments, exchanges, substitutions, or refunds. You are stuck with it. So covenants are not like the Constitution, which has an amendment process. They're not like treaties, because treaties are binding insofar as both parties still agree to it, which is different than a lifelong solemn binding agreement, which is a covenant. This one, once you have made that commitment, you've made it. You are stuck with it. There's no amendment process to a covenant. Again, this is where the marriage analogy comes in. Like, as long as we both shall live, and we're not going to go back and reopen the vows on the sickness and in health part, for instance. That's just not how marriage works. You agree to shackle yourself to another person for the rest of your life and say, we're going to learn to be real with each other and not run away screaming. And maybe between the two of us, we can work to be better people. And I'm going to be with you no matter what. And that commitment is incredibly important. That's the analogy to think of when you think about these covenants. It's a no matter what kind of thing. We are in this relationship come what may. Two clearly identifiable parties. The parties are named and they're specific. So, naming but not specific is, all y'all. Specific and named would be like the king of Tyre and the king of Babylon are the two parties. His Majesty, His Royal Highness, the king of Tyre, and His Majesty, the Royal Highness, the king of Babylon are entering into this agreement. They're not transferred between kings. So in the ancient world, when the king of Tyre died, in this particular example, covenant's over. There is no binding agreement left remaining between Babylon and Tyre at that point, because the king was representing the people, the king has died. Now there needs to be if you want to remain in that relationship, there has to be a renegotiation of the covenant. This doesn't mean, though, for instance, to use a biblical example, and we'll get into this more, but when Abraham died, the covenant with Abraham was over. Because again, you're going to have to look at the named parties. Who are the named parties? In the case of Abraham, he's not the only named party. His offspring happened to be the named party in that one, and that's what makes that differentiated. An oath-bound pledge. Okay, now we're going to get into what's actually sort of the mechanics of the covenant. Everything up to this point, you probably, we understood the words that were related to it. Solemn, binding agreement, it's lifelong, it's unchangeable. We understand those concepts. The pledge, though, this starts to get specific. We know what a pledge is, but there's a lot of, in particular, there's a lot of, I guess, ancient Near Eastern nuance here. So the heart of every covenant is the oath. It's the pledge to perform certain ongoing actions. It's what makes the covenant binding, along with the blessings and curses that will come later. But there are different kinds of oaths that define the kind of covenant one is entering into. So not all covenants are the same. I'm going to say that again. Not all covenants are the same. The reason I say that is because when you look at the Bible, we have more than one type of covenant. And the stipulations of the certain genre of covenant mean that the relationship between God and people, because of the nature of that oath, is going to be different under different covenants. So I don't want to say that the rules have changed in a cosmic sense, because God is unchanging. God has always wanted the same thing, and he's working us towards that. We discussed this last week where we talked about the trajectory, the arc of redemptive history. And it's sort of, it's a different way of getting at the ultimate restoration of our relationship with God. But there are some specific things in Scripture, certain promises that were specific to certain covenants, and certain punishments that were specific to certain covenants. That is inarguable. And so I don't want to say that it's different rules, because people could, you could extrapolate that a lot of different ways. It's better to do it in the specific, but specifically speaking, you can find some passages in Scripture that describe blessings that God will give or punishments that God will give that are specific to certain covenants. And so that's important to understand. So the kinds of oaths here are promissory oaths, parity oaths, and vassal oaths. So let's put on our ancient Near Eastern hat here. So a promissory oath. This is also called a royal grant, a royal land grant, often, but it needn't be solely restricted to land. Where a stronger party freely grants a benefit to a weaker party. So a king is going to gift, we'll say, land to an up-and-coming monarch someplace. You could possibly see this. I haven't found any historical evidence of this, though I haven't really looked very hard on it. But you could see this, for instance, as kind of a dowry. That might be possible. But the thing to know about a promissory grant is that you got one party that is freely granting benefits on another. So there's no stipulation to those benefits that are being given. There's only blessing with this covenant from one to another party. Parity is what it sounds like. So two parties are agreeing to a mutually balanced solemn obligation. You could think, hey, you have spice, I have sugar. Our people both want what the other has. So we're going to, as long as we both shall live, say solemnly twice a year, we will give you, 1 ton of sugar and you will give us 1 ton of spice. I don't know. I'm making that up right now. But that's a way to understand a parity covenant. The vassal treaty now is where this gets a little interesting. So a stronger party imposes solemn obligations onto a weaker party, though again, there's the solemn party is saying this is my take it or the stronger party is saying this is my take it or leave it offer, to which the vassal agrees. It's also called a suzerain treaty. If you've heard the word suzerain, it's the stronger, it's the one in charge. So a country is the suzerain of a city-state. This city-state has pledged its loyalty to this stronger state. And that city-state is going to give tribute to the stronger nation, or the stronger state, in exchange for protection, usually. So the typical way that this worked out was kind of like the example I gave earlier. The stronger army surrounds the smaller city, and then they send somebody in and says, you see my army out there? Okay, look, you know what we can do. I got a deal for you. Let's have some tribute a couple times a year. I'll protect you. You will bestow on us the kinds of things that we're looking for. We'll leave you alone. We'll let you be. So those are the kinds of oaths. It can be one party saying, I give you this. It can be another one that says, let's trade. And it can be another one which is, I will protect you if you pay me, if you give me tribute. These were, by the way, rather imbalanced to a lot of the time. The vassal, it's not like they were asked for, $20 a week. Right? They were bled a lot of the times for that. You're going to give me a lot, and it might hurt. But you'd prefer to have my protection. You'd prefer to not have my army at your door again. So those are the kinds of oaths. Or else suffer the wrath of God. So again, it's the solemn agreement that is sealed with an oath-bound pledge that both parties are agreeing to, or else suffering the wrath of God. So quite obviously, just like a law, a covenant can be broken. Marriage covenants can be violated. One of the parties may not follow through on their solemn obligations. And so it's not binding in the sense that it is impossible to do the opposite. It's binding in the sense that there's an or else. And so there are repercussions. There are blessings for obedience in some covenants, and there are curses for disobedience. So it's an ultimatum. You give me tribute, I give you protection, or else my army's back at your door. So that's how this works. There are curses for disobedience that are the enforcement mechanism in the covenant. And in the ancient Near East, again, it was the army returns. There could be other forms of consequence, and we'll definitely see that in the Bible, where God's form of the covenant curses. You can find the blessings and the curses of the Sinai covenant, Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. You should spend a lot of time in those chapters. If you haven't been there for a while, spend time in Leviticus 26. Spend time in Deuteronomy 28. Understand the or else that went along with the Sinai covenant. And then when the covenant is broken, the curses are put into effect. So it's not a binary thing either. It doesn't have to be. So a minor infraction. So you owe me 1 ton of spice and you sent me 900 or 90% of a ton. What would it be? Like 1,800 pounds of spice. So you short pay me. I might get cranky. I might come by and burn some fields. But you're still going to have your city. Major infractions would invoke the full curse of the covenant. Usually that means the offending party is obliterated. In the ancient Near East, if you just refused and said, nope, not going to do it, I'm not giving you a darn penny, you thief, that thief would come back with his army and flatten your city and salt the earth. Once the curses are fully carried out, the covenant is over. Neither party is bound to it anymore. So as soon as, now in many cases too, this is going to happen anyway, because it's going to be off with the king's head. And so now you're back at, as long as we both shall live. Well, the king's not living anymore, so the covenant's broken. But even if the king escapes, if the curses happen to be that your city will be destroyed, once the city's flattened, the covenant is over. So the execution of the curses ends the covenant. That's one of the 2 ways that the covenant can end. The covenant can end with the shovel, where one of you is in the ground. The covenant can end with the sword. And so that's how that ends up taking shape. Ratification. So a covenant also had a ratification adoption ceremony with sort of a ratification ritual. This often involved animal sacrifice. Parties are going to cut the animals in 2 and walk between them. This is really weird as far as we're concerned. We part company with weddings at this point and say that's not exactly how that takes place today. But ancient documents tell us that the purpose of this was to say, if either of us breaks the covenant, let what has happened to these animals happen to us. So that's the, you read about this in ancient Near Eastern documents where they will have a lamb and they will slay the lamb in front of everybody while they're going over the covenant curses. There's something very solemn, I guess, and it hits you in your gut when you are talking about the curses of a covenant, and then there's actually a sacrifice that takes place at that point. So that's what would happen in those ceremonies. And then afterwards, they would have a banquet to celebrate the ratification of the covenant. And I just want to point out, Exodus 24, if you've ever wondered what's going on, like, they go up to this place with sapphire and stone. God did not harm them, and they ate and drank. What's going on in Exodus 24? We're going to go over this again later, but The Israelites agree, we'll do everything the Lord has commanded. So there's a take it or leave it offer. We agree. So now the covenant's been agreed to. They sacrifice the bulls, they read the covenant, and then they go up and they eat and drink. What's going on? This is a covenant ratification ceremony. That is what's happening. Exodus 19 through Exodus 40 is one big long covenant section of Scripture, and you have the ratification ceremony there in Exodus 24. Biblical covenants also have a sign. So Noah, the sign is the rainbow. Abraham, the sign is circumcision. Not quite as nice as a rainbow. The Sabbath is the sign of the Sinai covenant. David's son is the sign of his covenant, and then baptism is the sign of the new covenant. So you've probably heard people compare circumcision and baptism as signs of the covenant. I would argue that the coming of the Holy Spirit in Acts 2 is also a sign of the new covenant. There might be a little bit of intramural disagreement about that, but I think that's also the indwelling of the Holy Spirit is a covenant marker of the new covenant as well. So when you come across a covenant, look for these things. Who are the parties involved? Who are the named parties involved? What kind of oath is being taken? Is it a promise? Is it parity? Is it a vassal covenant? I'll tell you right now, as far as the relevant covenants between God and humans, there's no kind of parity covenant. You wouldn't expect there to be. How could there be a parity covenant between the holy and the unholy? What blessings and curses, if any, are laid out? And then how does the covenant come to an end, if that's explicitly described? So we've been over the different kinds of covenants in the Bible a little bit, and like I said, you won't find a parity covenant, but there's different kinds of covenants. So you're going to find promissory, you're going to find vassal in the Bible. And like I said, one of these things is not like the other. And so if you remember these covenants here, you might even be looking at the spacing and you can kind of figure it out there. But the covenant with Noah, Abraham, the Davidic covenant, and the new covenant are all promissory covenants. These are God imposing obligations on himself with no requirement as far as the covenant's concerned on the other end. The Sinai covenant is a vassal covenant. And this is one of the most important things you're going to want to know for interpreting the Old Testament, is the law of Moses is related to a covenant that they entered into with God starting in Exodus 19. And the rules of a vassal covenant are the rules through which you should interpret the law and interpret the history of Israel and God's dealing with Israel. It helps in seeing the comparisons, such as the punishment that comes on Israel for disobedience, but also in the dispensation of grace that comes along with it, and how patient God was. Despite having full legal right to execute the full curses of the covenant, he withheld himself for centuries. And so, looking at those things is really, really important. Okay, so let's talk about some theological questions. So can a divine human covenant fail? It's a good question. So fail, we'll define failure. We'll define a covenant failure as the failure of a party to follow through on the obligations in the covenant. So can that happen between human beings and God? So God is never going to fail to keep his promises. It's just not in God's nature. It is impossible for God to not do what God has promised to do. This is just a by necessity, definition of God sort of thing. God cannot lie. God is perfectly good. God is completely powerful, can do whatever he wants, is sovereignly decreed everything that happens in history. So it's kind of silly to think that God could ever not keep his promise. It's also really important to remember that whether it's when you're reading another part of the Bible or whether you're going through something in life, God is never going to fail at God's promises. Nothing can thwart God from following through on his promises. Nothing, not even Satan, can thwart God from following through on his promises. And just as a quick editorial, keep that in mind, in your regular life. Satan cannot thwart God from following through on his promises. It just can't happen. God is way too strong, way too powerful, and has all this stuff worked out to, be bothered by the buzzing little gnat. Now, God is never going to die, so the covenant is always going to be enforced as long as the other party is around. So, like we described before, God's not going to die, so you're not going to have the shovel ending the covenant, at least on God's part. And if you look at the covenant with Abraham, the named party are Abraham and his seed, Abraham and his offspring. And through them, all nations will be blessed. All peoples are going to be blessed through Abraham. So it's not just a covenant with Abraham as a person, but it's Abraham and his offspring, and that's really important. And then God also promises that David's son is going to rule on the throne forever. It's not described very well at that point in time how that's going to happen, but the named party is going to be around forever. The new covenant, behold, I'm with you until the end of the age. So this is, when you look at these covenants, in terms of the Abrahamic, in terms of the Davidic covenant, in terms of the new covenant, you're not going to see those death separating those covenants. And because God is the only one in these covenants who's making any promises, and God can't fail to follow through on his promises, then these covenants right here will never fail. Because God will not die, and therefore you won't have the lifelong aspect terminating it, and it is impossible for God to not keep his promises. He's the only one making any promises, and so the promises will necessarily be put into effect. So there is no way that these covenants can fail. So God's promises will always come true. The one thing I suppose I wish I'd mentioned on this slide, the Sinai covenant can fail. Because there are requirements on humans in the Sinai covenant. All right, so why does God even use a covenant? Why? What's all this for anyway? You think about it, God is all powerful. He can write whatever rules he wants. There's no reason, and some people might look at this and say, isn't the fact that an omnipotent God uses the diplomacy of the ancient people a signal that this is really just some kind of, it's a reflection of the ancient psyche? There's not anything supernatural about this whole thing. Doesn't it show just how all too human this is what some people will say when they see the parallels with ancient genres and the Bible. And it's true he didn't have to, and yet it's there. And so it's true there is an association between the language that God is using and what was going on at that time. The first thing I guess I'll say to that one is, how else would you expect God to do it if he's going to try and interface with humans? I mean, do you want him to speak, Urdu to ancient people? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. There wouldn't be any form of communication. There wouldn't be any way it is at all possible to speak to them other than using their idiom. It would be, it's as simple as saying, well, why am I speaking English in the United States? Doesn't it just show how, all too immersed in this culture I am? Well, what do you expect me to speak? Klingon? God has to speak to people on their terms and ways they can understand. So the argument here really rests more on your assumptions, the presuppositional nature, than it does on anything about ancient history proven one way or another that this is a human writing or this is a divine writing. So I think that's kind of a silly argument that people sometimes give, that the parallel with ancient genres means that it's human. It's like, no, it means that God actually intended to communicate to people in ways they could understand. Because communication was intended. If communication wasn't intended, he can do whatever he wants. But if communication is intended, you have to speak, you have to communicate in a way that's comprehensible. So I find that argument to be a little ridiculous. But, why not just use language? Why not, why not drop something? Why not drop golden tablets out of the sky? I suppose that's another way that, the whole thing could have been done. So I think there's many answers to this. There's not like an authoritative kind of, the Bible doesn't say specifically, and then Yahweh told Moses, here's why I'm entering into a covenant with you, because I thought of all these other things and covenant was the best way to do it. Like, it doesn't get that explicit. So here's what I find convincing, my personal editorial comment, and I will just say I'm indebted to John Walton again on this one, because it was when I was listening to him discuss covenants that this whole line of thinking came to mind. So God wants to enter into a relationship with us. It's hard to do so if we don't know him. Also, like, think of the reality of the time. There were a whole lot of gods being worshipped at that time. Abraham and his family worshipped other gods. Says that in Joshua. We'll look at that a little bit later. So there's a whole pantheon of gods. And if God just blessed everybody, just gave blanket blessing to all people, the gods that those people are praying to are going to get the credit. God's particularity in telling Abraham, I will bless you in a specific way, and then following through on that blessing, and then not blessing in other places who would have given credit to their own gods. This establishes the benevolence and the uniqueness of Yahweh. That there's not really another way that this form of communication could have communicated what God intended, which is, I am God, there is no other. You should trust me. Don't go to the ziggurat. Don't go to the other temples. Don't think about those other gods. Trust me. Once we get to know this God, we learn to trust him to keep his promises. This shows up very much in Exodus 19. I am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. Hey, everybody, you remember the Egyptian chariots? You remember being locked by the water? You remember how the water kind of went like that and you made it across, but they didn't? That was me. I got a deal for you. Like, once you get to know God, you can learn to trust him to keep his promises. So I think the covenantal language and the solemn binding of that too, it's not like, hey, let's shake on it. It's, I am going to use the form of communication that is most serious and most solemn to you right now to communicate just how serious I am about making an arrangement with you, and then watch what happens with you versus what happens elsewhere, and what that reveals about me and my nature and my uniqueness relative to those other gods, and my willingness to look out for and care about your welfare. So that's my understanding of how this works. Okay, so the covenant with Abraham. So we're going to move to another section now that we've talked really generically about covenants. Let's look at the covenant with Abraham. And we're going to see a lot of the same stuff repeat. So Genesis 12, 1 through 3, this is the start of the promises to Abraham. So the Lord said to Abram, go out from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who treat you with contempt, and all the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. So this is the beginning of this whole, this is the whole beginning of the saga and the agreement and the revelation of God through Abraham. Excuse me. So let's do this right. So what I said in my guidelines video, all right, let's figure out the literary unit. All right, so where does this start? Where's this section? This is really the beginning, and it's in a sense it's the beginning. But remember the Toledot structure, the one, these are the generations of. You see this 11 times in Genesis, beginning with these are the generations of the heavens and the earth. These are the generations of Noah. So where is that? If these are the markers in Genesis that say when things began, where's the antecedent Toledot? Where's the time before this section where you have these are the generations of? So we can see, all right, what segment are we dealing with here? And so what you find in 11:27, this is just, chapter 11 goes 32 verses, so this is just a little bit behind from that. So these are the generations of Terah. And it says Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And then it goes on through Abram and Nahor took wives. Abraham's wife was named Sarah. Nahor's wife was named Milcah. Um, she was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. Sarah wasn't able to conceive. She had no child. So why Terah and not Abraham? Or, Abram in this case? It's an interesting question. If you're going to put markers, if you think that the markers are supposed to be about the important people, then you might say, especially because there is no here the generations of Abraham is far. I don't think so. Let me just make sure of that before I just boldly say that. I am almost convinced that I looked at this just the other day, but let me just be for sure. Okay, so you have the heavens and the earth in 2:4. You have Adam in 5:1. You have Noah in 6:9. The sons of Noah in 10:1. Shem in 11:10. Terah 11:27. That goes all the way to chapter 25. So it's a long time. Oh, I did blur out there. I apologize. So it's a long time, the generations of Terah, and that's taking you basically through most of the story of Abraham. I believe in 25:11, that's the death of Abraham. And immediately after the death of Abraham, you see these are the generations of Abraham's son Ishmael. So Toledot Ishmael, 25:12, but it doesn't spend too much time on that because 25:19, generations of Isaac, you get Esau in 36:1, and then you get Jacob in 37:2. So those are the, you get another Esau in 36:9. So those are your markers, and there's lots of important people that are in there. So why Terah? Well, so much of the drama here is about Abram and his transformation into Abraham and his descendants. We're not spoiling it here. What did we say in verse 30? Sarah wasn't able to conceive. She did not have a child. This is setting up the whole story of Abraham and his son, and the fact that the blessing is going to be transmitted through Isaac. And so much of what's about to happen has everything to do with Abraham and his offspring. And if you put that here, and you just say, and he had kids, well, then you're skipping the whole point, the entire point of this next section. Not the entire point, but one of the linchpins of the whole next section is about how Abraham got to have a son, and then what happens to that son. So it sets the stage, like I was saying, for the drama of Abraham in the coming chapters, setting the scene for God's covenant and his miraculous work. And then, this just right here, again, let's remind ourselves a little bit of background. So Joshua 24. So remember when I said in the guidelines video, one of the things to look for are long speeches by an approved person. Well, Joshua is an approved person. And Joshua said to the people in chapter 24, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River, worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the region beyond the Euphrates River, led him throughout the land of Canaan, and multiplied his descendants." And so, what's the weird thing going on here? It's them worshiping other gods. I don't know how often we think about this. We went over that a little bit in the earlier slides. But Abraham was brought up in a house. Let's think about this now in the context of Abraham. He's brought up in a house that worshipped other gods aside from Yahweh. The text makes no comment but Abraham somehow believed all through his youth that Yahweh was the one true God. It doesn't say that. We don't really know. Did Abraham and his family worship Yahweh among other gods, or did they not worship Yahweh at all? Again, the text is silent. We don't know. I would say reading the story against this backdrop gives us an insight to the development of the relationship between God and Abraham. I would think that it's hard for me to go there and say that Abram definitely, for one reason or another, just was a Yahweh worshiper the entire time. It's hard for me to think that he was not involved in the worship of other gods at some point. Could it be? Could be. The text doesn't say. But he definitely grew up in that milieu. He grew up in that household. That much we can take from the text for sure. And so, it gives you an idea of how God is approaching this relationship. He's reaching out to uh, a pagan who's got a tough family situation because he's got no heir. Uh, and the faith that Abraham ultimately demonstrates, he's not coming from some sort of monotheistic, temple Judaism kind of idea. That doesn't exist yet. It's not like he's been taught all his life about what Yahweh has done for his ancestors. This would have been the case for many of the people in the Israelite monarchy. This would be the case during even some of the Exodus. This would be the case after the monarchy fell in Israel, that they're steeped in this understanding, at least to some degree, that look at what Yahweh has done for us through our history. That's not the case for Abraham. You have what Yahweh did with Noah, and so I think it's reasonable to think that he probably may have heard about Yahweh at some point. But so but let's understand how Abraham is approaching this and how God is approaching this, what their contexts are. It's not like this is the single God that Abram has been taught to put all of his trust in his entire life who's appearing to him. This is, as far as he might be concerned, just one of the gods. And so what is Abram told by Yahweh? Go, leave the land you know, leave your family, and go where I'll show you. You're being spoken to by a God. That's a big deal. But get up and leave the land, leave my family, go where I will show you. The land was what gave you identity. Your family is what gave you a support network. Big families at the time, households like this, is what, you didn't have urban living. The people had to fend for themselves off of the land. The land was sustenance, and the land was also your identity. This belongs to us, and this is where we get our crops from. This is where we get our water from. This is what, by the way, like living water and still water. Living water was a spring. Still water was just like static water. If you had a spring, you had living water on your land. So just bookmark that next time you see Jesus talking about living water. Maybe I'll do a video on that at some point. But when that's on your land, these are the things that you possess that mean that your family can continue. He's told to basically break with not just, land is the way we think about it. Leave the land that you know. Well, if I move from, Chicago to Cleveland, whatever, in terms of, the relative meaning that would have had to Abram. Leaving the land you know, it would be a little bit more like leave here and go to Siberia, then leave your family. There's no support structure anymore, and go where I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. Make your name great, and you will be a blessing, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Let's break this down. So, what's going on here? I will make you a great nation. I will make your name great. I will bless you, and you will be a blessing. In Hebrew, this is called synonymous parallelism. You see this all over the place in the Psalms. Repetition was one of the primary literary devices that Hebrews used to emphasize something. And for anybody who happened to attend church when I gave my sermon a few months ago now, actually, on Isaiah chapter 6. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. That thrice repetition is designed like, this is the most important thing. Look right here. Holy is his name. He is holy. Did you get the point that he's holy? So the form of repetition is the way that they emphasize things. And so I will a great nation. Interesting. I will make you a great nation. It's so funny too how you see like what you want to see. I didn't even notice that I omitted the word make until I'm looking at this right now. Even when I read it just then, I saw it with the word make right there. So I will make you into a great nation. I will make your name great. So these two things are parallel. I will bless you, and you will be a blessing. These two things are parallel. We see that so in the Psalms, God is our refuge and strength, very present help in trouble. So the varied repetition. Notice that, it is interesting. They're not always fully synonymous. Sometimes they emphasize an aspect. So I will bless you and you will be a blessing. It's almost like the third one actually tells you how this works. I will bless you, you will be a blessing, and all the people on the earth will be blessed through you. So my blessing is going to be conferred to you as a blessing, which is going to be the blessing that all people are going to receive. So my blessing is transmitted to everybody through you. And so that's an interesting form of this parallelism right here. Okay, bonus points. And sorry, this just got a little small, but there's going to be a lot of text on this slide. Forgive me here, but I thought about breaking it up, and I thought it should all just go on here. So I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. So, what earlier part in Genesis does this contrast with? What story? From Genesis chapter 11, right beforehand. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top to the sky. Let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the earth." So, Tower of Babel story, Genesis 11, let us make a name for ourselves. God saying here, right at the beginning of chapter 12, I will make your name great. I will make your name great. So, what's going on here? God is saying, I will choose how this goes. It is going to happen through Abraham. The whole idea here, when they talked about making their name great, God is not completely opposed to the idea of names being made great, but he's going to determine how it goes. Abraham's name is going to be great, and it's going to be great for the right reason. And you see here, hold on, I just want to make sure, yeah. So here, I'll get to this in a second. So through you all peoples will be blessed comes next. Just a quick note, this isn't all persons will be blessed. Literally, you would think of this as like clans. Like in Revelation 5, you purchased with your blood, this is speaking to the Lamb, speaking to Jesus, people from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. So all people groups, all nation states, men, people from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation are going to receive blessing through you. Here's a point I want to make. Notice how your interpretation of Babel matters here. If this is an attempt to unilaterally reestablish sacred space in Babel, then God's promise of restoration, of blessing to all people, makes sense. God is telling us how he will reestablish right relationship between humans and God. It's going to be through Abraham. At risk of putting too fine a point on it, like if the idea when you read Babel is something like, oh, it's pride, and pride is a bad thing, and that's what we learned from Babel, then this just appears to be another story that popped out of nowhere. It's not part of the narrative. But we talked about this in the guidelines video. The Bible is a story. This is all connected. Everything here is intentional. God is not random. This isn't cobbled together ridiculous stories. The Tower of Babel coming beforehand is related to this story. It's we're going to go through this in a later slide, but using the context of Scripture to help you understand it is really helpful. Otherwise, it just there's a lesson on pride in here somewhere for no good reason, and then we start talking about Abraham. Okay, well, Abraham's a good guy, but and eventually we'll get to Abraham, and that'll teach us about trusting God with the sacrifice of Isaac. Where we break the text up into these little moralizing vignettes, when that's not the point. The point of this story and the point of the Tower of Babel is showing how God is going to be dealing with humans to reestablish us to our right relationship with him and in our vocation as his image bearers to administrate his grace here as his royal priests. That is the thing. And if you see it that way, if you want to see some of the establishment for that. If you haven't, go back and watch episode number 1. We go through a lot of this in the pre-Abrahamic history. Uh, Seeing the Bible as a whole narrative really helps understand what's going on here. Okay, so soapbox aside, all right, so what is Abraham told by Yahweh? So we've got these 3 blessings. So Abram goes. There's more promises here. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your offspring. Now we've already been told in chapter 11, verse 30, Sarah was unable to conceive. She did not have a child. Abram doesn't have children at this point. If you need proof of that, keep reading. But Abraham has 2 promises here. No offspring at this point, so there's an explicit promise of the land. But the thing that's going to, hit Abram really hard is the offspring part, because he doesn't have any. As far as he's concerned, he happened to marry a woman who's unable to conceive. That's the way he thinks of it, that's for sure. Ancient idea would have been that the issue's entirely with the woman on this one. But he got unlucky, and he's going to, likely have no heir. But this God is saying, you go do this. Okay, great nation, I'll bless you. All the peoples on the earth are going to be blessed. And then this land is going to be given to your offspring. So the land being transferred to the offspring is no big deal. That's what happened all the time back then. But I will possess this land and I'm going to have offspring? That's pretty amazing. And that's actually part of the promise. So in summary, God is promising Abram will be a great nation. Blessing is going to be given to Abram and all people. And there's going to be land associated with this. And I want to talk about the land promise again just a little bit more. We've been over it a bit, but this is very, very, very important to the Israelites and in the ancient Near East generally. Land was livelihood. It's your sustenance. It's security for your offspring. It's political identity. It's family identity. Without land, it's hard to think how any of these other promises of great nations and offspring and everything, continued generations, could possibly occur. You needed to possess that land. It was the only way that would be possible. The new covenant, listen to me here. The new covenant is a new paradigm. When we come to everlasting covenants, changing of the heart, forgiveness of sins, these kinds of things that affect our psyches personally. The Abrahamic covenant, the Sinai covenant, the Davidic covenants all had explicitly material blessing attached to them. The land was an explicit material blessing. Sinai, the blessings in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, these are explicit material blessings. David, you will have a son. He will be on the throne. Now, when we get to David, we'll be talking about a concept called already, not yet. And there is a sense in which there's an immediate fulfillment and there's an ultimate fulfillment. But the immediate fulfillment was a very specific material blessing. And so when you see these covenants, God is dealing with people in concrete ways in most of these covenants. And then, the covenant with Noah is sort of it's an agreement not to inflict material blessing. I'm sorry, the cat distracted me again. It's an agreement not to have material punishment come upon you again, not material blessing. So this land promise was extraordinarily meaningful. But it's also a way that you could see concretely. Imagine if he'd said, Abram, your sins are forgiven. Abram has no concept of what that means at this time. That is not the way that people thought about religion. God is beginning his relationship with people. And this is the way that God is interacting with people. He's reaching out to them. He's intending communication. And intended communication involves communicating in a way that they will understand. And so this is, the beginning of what we would call progressive revelation. You're going to see these, doctrines in this theology just grow and grow and grow throughout Scripture. But it starts with revelation that can be understood. And then it progresses into something that is full theology. I mean, imagine the idea of, uh, you know, the doctrine of imputation or the incarnation being described at this point. It's like that wouldn't mean anything. Nothing like what it meant after God had revealed himself through Abraham, through Sinai, through David, and through Jesus. All of a sudden, all of this makes so much more sense and so much richer. But you got to lay the groundwork first. That's what's happening here. So let's look at the covenant markers. So the parties involved, God and Abram, and his offspring. That's a really important part here. The offspring are included in those to whom promises are being made, even though they're not there right then. They're parties, because they have a promise specifically for them. That land is going to belong to them, and their nation status is going to bring blessing to all nations, all clans, all peoples. What kind of oath is being made? Well, it's not a parity oath. It's not a vassal oath. This is promissory. Only God is making any promises here. I will do this, I will do that, I will do that. And there's no, and then you must do this, you must do that. It's fair to say, or to ask, well, isn't Abram required to go from the land and leave his father's house? Like, isn't that kind of a condition of the covenant? And in some sense, I mean, God is giving him that command, but notice that there's not a if statement in there. Go from the land, from your relatives, your father's house, to the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. You will be a blessing. It's not a if you do this. The text doesn't say if you do this, if you do this, if you do this, then I will, then I will, then I will. And if you don't, there are curses. That would be the marker of a vassal covenant. So there's the subjunctive, the if statements, the conditional statements aren't in there, and there's no curses for disobedience, which is actually the next point right here. Blessing to Abraham and all people on the earth. So those are the blessings. The only curse pronounced is to those who treat Abraham with contempt. So another telltale sign of a promissory covenant. You would have some kind of binding curse stipulation on Abram if he didn't follow through on whatever his promises were, if you were going to regard this as a vassal covenant. So it's very clearly, there's only one making any promises, and there's no recourse to Abram really in the covenant language if he doesn't follow through on leaving his land and his relatives. That's not a covenant stipulation. Is it a command of God? Yes, it is. Is it a stipulation to this covenant? No, it's not. And how will it come to an end? It doesn't seem like it will. The text seems to promise an eschatological ongoing blessing. All peoples will be blessed through you. So then let's go to chapter 15, the ratification ritual. So the whole arrangement isn't truly a covenant until the ratification in chapter 15. The covenant relationship like this between a God and humanity is unparalleled in ancient Near Eastern history and literature. So even though we can say, oh, look at the genre that was used, this is a covenant genre, this is how the people spoke then, yes, all of that true, all of that very true and very necessary, but this kind of a relationship between God and humanity, not paralleled. You don't see anything like this. Gods in the ancient world may have been protectors, but they never entered into something like this. It's like we said, we made a constitution with God, or we made a treaty with God. There was a whole lot more reciprocity. Their idea was that, the vegetative cycle was their god losing to the forces of chaos or to other gods, maybe gods of other states that were attacking theirs. And so they needed to make the right sacrifices and do the right rituals in order to empower their god to fight back. So it's sort of this like voodoo kind of reciprocity thing going on. If we do good things for our God, then he'll be able to do good things for us. That's not a covenant. That's an entirely different arrangement than a covenant. Okay, so 15, 1 through 8. That's where you're going to see the ratification ritual. So I'm going to try and go through this relatively quickly here, because I've been talking for well over an hour now. But okay, so 15, I'm going to be reading from the Holman translation if you're trying to follow along. So after these events, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward will be very great. But Abram said, Lord God, what can you give me, since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? Abram continued, Look, you've given me no offspring, so a slave born in my house will be my heir. Now the word of the Lord came to him. This one will not be your heir. Instead, one who comes from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look at the sky and count the stars if you're able to count them. Then he said to him, Your offspring will be that numerous. Abram believed the Lord, Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am Yahweh who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, Lord God, how can I know that I will possess it? Okay, and this seems to progress a little bit. So God says, your reward's going to be great. That's in verse 1. And Abram says, okay, so how about this whole offspring thing? I'm not getting any younger. Slave born in my house will be my heir. So in the ancient Near East, sometimes elderly people with children adopted an adult to take care of them in exchange for their estate passing on to that adult when they died. So in this case, Eliezer is named, at least in my translation here. There is a footnote that says the Hebrew is obscure. That's a rather candid footnote. So Abram seems to believe that's what's going to happen, that his heir relationship is going to be with a slave. He's not going to have any offspring, and so when he gets old and can't take care of himself, he's going to need to give his estate away to some other adult in exchange for caretaking in old age. This is despite the promises that he's been given. And so he's given God a little bit of a, what gives, man? I moved, I left my family, I left my land, and you talked about, your grand visions of great nations and offspring of which there are none, and blessing to all people. Don't feel particularly blessed right now. Here you are telling me my reward's going to be great. Why should I believe you? And God says, not only are you going to have an heir, but look at the stars. That's how many descendants you're going to have. You can't even count them. I'm God after all. And Abram says, how do I know this is going to happen? Okay, so yeah, that's the backdrop there. God's response to that is a covenant ratification ceremony. So in response to Abram saying, for real? God invokes language and idiom that is comprehensible and is some of the most solemn and deadly serious ways to communicate how sure God is that this is going to happen. He says, bring me a 3-year-old cow, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. So Abram brought all these to God, split them down the middle, and laid the pieces opposite each other, but he did not cut up the birds. Traditionally, the birds' heads were actually pinched, a little gross, but when it says he did not cut up the birds, it is still, we should still believe that they were split in half, even though it doesn't say that. That's usually what happened to them, at least from what we can see in other documents. Birds of prey came down on the carcasses. Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and suddenly a great terror and darkness descended on him. The Lord said to Abram, know this for certain, your offspring will be foreigners in the land that does not belong to them. They will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. However, I will judge the nation they serve, and afterwards they will go out with many possessions. But you will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a ripe old age. In the 4th generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and flaming torch appeared and passed between the divided animals. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, I give this land to your offspring, from the brook of Egypt to the Euphrates River, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. The word of the Lord. Okay, so what's going on here? No new promises, but here's the guarantee. By the way, what's going on with the animals? We talked about this a little bit beforehand. 5 animals cut in 2, laid opposite each other. In the ancient Near Eastern history, as we described, kings would do this during royal land grant ceremonies and walk between the halves. And their text interpreted as, if either of us breaks the covenant, let what happened to these animals happen to the covenant breaker. And the smoking fire pot and the flaming torch appearing and passing between the divided animals. So this just seems really weird if you read it without its context. Okay. Like, again, strip away the context. God is speaking to Abram in a vision, and then spooky stuff happens. There's a torch and a pot, and they go between these cut up animals. Isn't that weird? If you see it as a covenant ratification ceremony, you totally understand what's going on, and you totally understand the meaning that these things had, which is the solemn promise. God is saying, I am not God. Let me be slain, even though that's a contradiction in terms, if this does not happen. That is how serious this is. And that's why the next sentence says, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram. That's why those two sentences are put together, because they make sense put together. Yes, so deadly serious covenant. But remember, only God has made promises here. God is swearing by his own necessary existence that these things are going to happen. So that's the significance of the ratification ritual that's going on at this point. It's going to be hard, though. That's the other thing we learned. So there is a little bit of additional content that Abram is given. The bondage in Egypt is foretold. By the way, bondage is the term for the slavery in Egypt. Exile is for the exile in Babylon. Those two terms are kind of reserved for each other, so there's no confusion about, even though they both represent times when foreign powers had the Israelites sort of in their under their control in slavery, away from their land, and they were caught up in that. The bondage and the exile are the two terms. If you hear someone say bondage, they're talking about Egypt. Exile, they're talking about Babylon. The iniquity of the Amorites hasn't reached its full measure. What do you make of that? It's an interesting thing for God to throw in there. They'll be there 4 generations, and then they'll come back after all the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So that'll take 4 generations. I would say read Isaiah 10. So God uses the nations to punish other nations. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, and in whose hand is the staff of my indignation, if I remember right. He has other purposes that are only alluded to within the scriptures. So Israel's going to go, and Israel has their story. When they come back, we know what's going to happen. They're going to be given a solemn command to drive out the Canaanites. And the Amorites. I mean, these start to become synonymous later. And so Israel is going to fulfill being the staff of God's wrath upon the Amorites, but once their iniquity is fully there. So God has some purposes that are going on that we don't see all of in Scripture. This isn't the complete and total revelation of the only things that God has ever been a part of. This is a story. It's a story for us. But we believe that there are things that are happening today that are part of God's plan that aren't recorded in the book. The Bible is supposed to give us the story, the important narrative. But there's other things going on, and God's using Israel in ways that become clear later. And then on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. I will give this land to your offspring. So that is a big part of the covenant right there. The land is part of the covenant. The offspring are part of the covenant. Okay. Why does any of this matter? So, okay, we've been through this whole thing, and cool, we understand it a little bit better. But I want to put this in the context of what's happened so far. Genesis 1 and 2, God and humanity are in right relationship. Humans are working out their vocation as God's image bearers, his royal priesthood as administrators in his good creation. Genesis 3, there's rebellion. There's loss of that relationship. Sin mars our ability to be who we were made to be, and yet God promises that this will eventually be overcome. It will crush the head of the serpent. There's a lot of promise about how what has happened here is not the end of the story. Then we start going through, okay, what happens to try and reestablish this relationship? How does this work? How is God going to do it? In Genesis 6, God is angered by human sin, and he wipes out the evildoers. Noah, you and your family, you're cool. Everybody else, we're going to drown them out. But it doesn't solve the problem of human rebellion. Even after the flood, God says, I will not flood the earth, even though the heart of man is always inclined towards evil. He's telling us there that the evil has not been purged, even by taking a righteous person and preserving him and his family. There's something fundamental in our nature. The annihilation is not going to restore, is not going to, blowing this all up and starting over again is not how God's going to do this. And it's certainly not going to, okay, if we just get rid of all the bad guys and we leave only the good guys, then everything will come back together. God is telling us that's not how it's going to work. So then humans try. Humans try to reestablish a relationship on their own using false pagan forms of worship. This is the Tower of Babel. If you want to see that explanation, you can go back and watch week 1. God defies their overture. He dismisses them with prejudice. He does come down the ziggurat, but then he wrecks that place and says, no, this is not how it's going to happen. And instead, he takes the lowly son of a pagan family with no children and promises to work a miracle through him. Offspring, land, and blessing to all nations. The Abrahamic project is the blessing to all people. It goes all the way to Revelation 21. It goes to the whole tribe, tongue, people from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation have been purchased with Jesus' blood. The blessing to all people is ultimately accomplished through Abraham into the nation of Israel that eventually produces the eternal Davidic king, which is the Messiah, which happens to be the incarnate Son of God, who accomplishes the ultimate atonement and then establishes the means by which we can get back to right relationship with God. The Abrahamic project includes all of that. This is the beginning. And then God makes himself known by fulfilling these promises. So that's how the Abrahamic covenant fits into the narrative of Scripture. And so I hope this was helpful. That's all for now. That's week 2. Next week is going to be about the Sinai covenant and the differences there. And so a lot of the covenant stuff is going to be relevant again there. But I hope, if you're local and you're around, October 8th, 6:30 p.m., First Presbyterian Church of River Forest. I actually just realized I won't be uploading this to YouTube until after the class takes place, so I don't know why I bothered giving the date and time, but I hope you watch the next few videos. Thanks for watching.